Midlife is an opportunity for us to do a little bit more self-inquiry, a little bit more self-analysis, so that we can figure out what we're going to be looking like, feeling like, how we're going to be being in the next stage in our life. And there are 7 behaviors that we should really be paying attention to because they may be signpost signals that a little bit more work needs to be done, a little bit more focus needs to be done. And really, this is about addressing these things so that moving forward, you're able to have the biggest and best version of your life and thriving. So let's start by looking at each of these and maybe providing a little bit more analysis and discussion about them. So the first one is frequent irritability or outbursts of anger. So for me, one of my go-to emotions in terms of my lack of emotional development and emotional intelligence was anger. So I thrived in the angry space a lot in my life. And your go-to emotion may not be anger. It could be any one of others, right? But when we are in a stage, for example, of irritability often, this is a good indicator that there's something amiss, that there are things that are troubling you when something that's inconsequential results in a large and extraordinary response of irritability. What might that mean? Well, that there are parts of you that still need to be healed, parts of you that have unresolved issues. For me, it was a lot of lack of self-love, for example, and I would turn on others because I didn't know how to, first of all, love myself and then extend that loving presence to others, be that in an intimate situation, collegial situations, or with my peers. Now, another thing that can happen, another behavior that may be common is sarcasm or critical humor. And oftentimes what sarcasm is doing is it's masking emotions, emotional pain, it's masking some inner discomfort. So it comes out in this sort of caustic, critical, sarcastic humor. And you'll see this quite readily in a lot of people who use humor to cover up their own pain. And that's what I did for many, many years. Very good at getting a row or a laugh from others. And that gave me a false sense of comfort. It covered up some of my own inner issues that I wasn't really addressing. Here's another one, difficulty trusting or forming close relationships. And in my case, I would say especially with other men. So depending on how we grew up and what our formation of relationships looked like up to the age of 5 or 6, that can really imprint how we form relationships later in life. And in my situation, for example, I had a very strained familial environment where my father was not always present. When he was, it was very, very toxic. And so I didn't understand how to have relationships with other men. I didn't know that I could trust other men. I didn't know that there's a side of men that can be caring, nurturing, supportive, and helpful. And so I would not build strong male relationships. It took a long time for me to figure that out. Another behavior is when we start relying on alcohol or other substances, for example, for coping mechanisms to help manage our feelings. And so the sedative effect of alcohol kind of like tempers some of that stuff. But then, as we well know, those of us who did drink, I spent many 2 years with a lot of heavy alcohol consumption, that in the alcohol consumption, it also breaks down the inhibitors, and then we can say and do things that are not helpful. And there are other substances too. A lot of people may use cannabis or what have you to sort of numb things, to take the edge off, if you will. But in so doing, we're not really connecting to and managing our own emotional intelligence, our own emotional well-being. And so we're covering it up. We're using these mechanisms to cope. Not necessarily the most effective way of doing things. And then Perhaps we could look at our patterns of behavior. Maybe there's patterns of conflict, the patterns of conflict that keep coming up and being reborn and replayed at all times. And this could be in your home life, the types of arguments or situations you continually find yourself having with your family members, with your partner, with your kids, maybe with your parents, still at this stage, if they're still around. But these patterns of behavior, and then at work, so I recall in my career, I worked in the same career for 25 years. So I had lots of long-term colleagues, and the types of conflicts that would arise and how we chose to or not to deal with them was pretty indicative, right? So these patterns of conflict are telling because it shows and demonstrates to us where we can do some of that self-awareness and personal development and some emotional growth. One that's really typical for a lot of us in midlife is just feeling stuck, blocked, or lost, not really sure of our goals or how to achieve our goals if we are still setting them. Or in many cases, what happens is we end up going through the motions and just kind of living on autopilot. And when we're in this mode of feeling stuck and blocked, oftentimes what happens is we feel a lot of resentment. And that can be by looking around and seeing, well, why are others seemingly more content than me? Why are others making their way into new and different positions when I'm not? Why do I feel so stuck and uncertain about where I'm going? And that deeper dissatisfaction that flows out of that can really have powerful implications in terms of our overall well-being, vis-a-vis our relationship with ourselves and vis-a-vis the relationship with our friends, our family, etc. And really where a lot of this stems from is this behavior, this last one, of avoiding our emotions. And it can be very typical because as boys, for example, most of us weren't shown how to tap into our emotions, to understand them when they came up, to identify them. And so we grow up mostly avoiding a lot of that part of ourselves, the emotional component. And as I said earlier, for me, the default ended up just being angry about everything and really not having a clear indication of, well, why is that? Even though I would feel guilty and bad at times for the angry outbursts and the rage that I sometimes felt. But I really had no concept of, how to address that, where it was coming from. And so sometimes what it ends up looking like when we're avoiding our emotions are these behaviors of keeping really busy. Maybe you're the high achiever type and working excessive hours and things like that, like just keeping yourself going, because in so doing, in the busyness, you can continue to avoid emotions. And it can also look like being emotionally detached, so not being emotionally plugged in to others. And you can see this most in your family, where perhaps your partner is more emotive and frustrated by your seeming lack of connection to her or their emotional needs. And you maybe default to the rational mind about, well, I'm doing this, that, and the other thing, get off my back kind of stuff, right? And that emotional detachment can play out in your relationship with your kids and your relationship with your colleagues. So you may be perceived as that sort of cold and rather aloof, guilty as charged, guy by a lot of your colleagues. And in my situation, what I would do is just choose to stay in my office and not really involve myself in the camaraderie. I didn't sit in the lunchroom and have lunch with my colleagues. I would either go home for lunch or eat at my desk, kind of thing. So these emotional detached kind of actions are indicative of us avoiding our emotions. So these are areas where we want to be concerned about our own self-awareness, our own development. So if you have any of those, that frequent irritability, if you have sarcasm and critical humor as a go-to, if you find it difficult to foster and form close relationships. If you tend to rely on substances, like you get home from work and you have to have one, two, or three glasses, if you name the substance, if you have repeated patterns of conflict, if you find that you're feeling stuck and blocked a lot of the time, and if you're avoiding emotions, these are all really strong indicators that it's time to do some of that deeper work. And the ways that you can do this are many. And I wouldn't be prescriptive about any of that because for each of us, we need to find our own path. And that's really, really important. So it could look like therapy. It could look like joining a men's group. It could look like hiring a coach to move you through some of this midlife challenge. There's a lot of opportunities. Some of you might just choose to read and engage in sort of YouTube expertise, and that's fine. But what we want to make sure we're doing is we're not just intellectually addressing some of these things, that we're actually using tools and skills to move forward. Because information is only that. Information is not transformation. And oftentimes we need tools and practices to get us to and through some of the stuff that we're dealing with. So I hope that this has been helpful in terms of looking at 7 areas that might be signals that it's time to do a little bit of deeper inquiry, that it's time to do a greater dive into that self-awareness, because this is the time to do it. In midlife, we have such a great opportunity here for what the next stage is going to look like. And for most of us, we don't want it looking like more of the same. We want it to look a lot more positive, a lot more of this sort of thriving energy, that we're actually showing up in ways that, we perhaps didn't allow ourselves to in the first half. So I wish you that. I wish you an opportunity to grow and expand and become the biggest and brightest and fullest version of yourself. Take good care.